I'm here today with Dr. Griffin Cole. He's a biologic dentist practicing here in Austin. He's also a board certified naturopathic physician and holds certification in integrative biologic dental medicine. So I know that you really are on the forefront of this water fluoridation issue. So maybe just give us an introduction. What is water fluoridation?
Water fluoridation is the process of adding fluoride or a type of fluoride to a water supply in the hopes of fighting cavities is the intended function anyway. So they try to bring fluoride up to what they consider an optimal level, they being our probably the EPA and Health and Human Services are the most recognizable government agencies that try to determine this level. And so they'll go to water supplies, and most water supplies have some natural fluoride already. So they'll add artificial fluoride to it to bring it up to what they consider to be the optimal level to help fight cavities. That's what it is.
So there's definitely a lot of controversy over this issue. Can you describe why this is such a controversial issue?
So I feel it's controversial for several reasons. The first being that it's not actually doing its intended function, which is to help fight cavities. And we've now shown this over the last couple of decades with a lot of scientific studies. And beyond that, we're actually showing harm. Instead of doing what it was intended to do, which was to help those who maybe couldn't afford to get proper dental care, maybe can't afford to get a toothpaste that has fluoride or have a good diet, it's having just the opposite effect. And so that's the first issue. The second issue is that there's, it's a one-size-fits-all. So when you add this stuff to the water, and this would be considered really mass medication because nobody's really given their informed consent to receive this thing. And by the way, fluoride is the only thing that's added to water supplies as a medication. Everything else is added as sort of a purifier or a cleanser to actually make the water safe, like chlorine, for example. Fluoride is added strictly for the process of trying to help somebody medically. It's a one-size-fits-all, so there's no dose control. So an adult, say my size, could maybe tolerate a certain amount per day, whereas maybe an infant, for example, who's bottle-fed and a major part of their diet is water, they're going to get way more than I will based on our weights. So that's a problem. And then beyond that, it's not even fluoride, or at least it's not the fluoride that you and I know of. Sodium fluoride is what's in most toothpaste. The actual fluoride that's added to the water supplies, at least 96% of them in this country, is hydrofluosilicic acid, which is a waste product from the fertilizer industry. So interesting thing on that too is that the EPA, as I mentioned earlier, who maybe regulates this, they don't regulate the process of where the fluoride comes from and who it goes to. That's not regulated at all. So what's really interesting about this is that hydrofluosilicic acid is extremely corrosive and toxic, and in fact it's so hazardous that the EPA won't allow it to be dumped in landfills, and it won't allow it to be vaporized into the air, which is why they required all the companies to add these scrubbing stacks that would catch it as they were making the fertilizer. So the question is, if it's not allowed to be dumped in the landfills safely or aerated up into the air, why should we believe that it's safe when it's actually put into the water supply? And so that's the other problem that I have with it, and most people do. There's other issues, but those are probably the three main ones.
Yeah. Well, those are definitely big ones. Can you describe any of the studies or reasons that they do believe that fluoridating the water would cause the prevention of cavities, or why they believe that would work?
That's a great question. Honestly, it's a long answer, so I'll try to keep it as brief as I can. Early on, probably back in the 40s, they being some scientists, were noticing that there were some areas where some of the children had spots on their teeth. But when they were examined by dentists, they didn't have cavities. So they thought maybe there's a correlation. And this happened in Colorado and in Texas, and it was there really wasn't a whole lot of study to actually prove that this happened. But they basically found out that these were areas that had heavy natural fluoride, and so therefore they thought if these kids don't have cavities, it must be the fluoride, and that's basically how these things started. Now, once this got going and there was a lot of protests against this, a lot of medical doctors came out against this, they then started doing studies later on down the road. And the most famous one, or the largest one, was in 1986. It was funded by the National Institute of Dental Research. And in all fairness, it was a huge study. It was about 39,000 children in 84 different communities. And they were comparing fluoridated areas versus non-fluoridated. And when they came out with the results, they said, golly, sure enough, those in the fluoridated areas have much less cavities, therefore this works. Well, the Safe Water Foundation, under the Freedom of Information Act, said, can we see the data? We'd like to look at the data. So they got all the data, and they went through it, and it took a long time. And in the end, what they found was that the actual results showed that it was 0.6 of one tooth surface had less cavities. So we're talking literally 0.6%, right? 0.6 of one tooth had less decay, because it's all based on surfaces of the teeth. There's like 5 surfaces per tooth in the back and 4 in the front. And so out of 100 possible tooth surfaces, 0.6 of one showed less decay rates. That's not enough to say that something works. And as I mentioned to you before, whenever they do these studies too, and they compare an area that's fluoridated versus one that's non, it's not really a valid study, because the children in the fluoridated areas have their teeth erupt up to 1 year later. So when you're taking a snapshot of, say, a 3-year period of time, and you say, well, gosh, there's less cavities on these teeth in the fluoridated areas, it's because they have less teeth they're counting. So it's not a very fair study. So I can tell you that there has never been a truly randomized, double-blind clinical study to prove that either fluoridation works, and there's never been one to show that it actually worked after they did it in certain cities. So, for instance, in San Antonio, Texas, which was done about 10 years ago, they finally added fluoride to the water. It's now been 10 years. There still has not been a study, and there won't be, to say, are there less cavities? What I can tell you is that if you go to the city health department, there's actually higher decay rates in San Antonio since that time. So it's interesting.
That is interesting. And it also kind of ignores that there's a lot of other factors that determine whether there's going to be kids with cavities, like what they're eating and how knowledgeable they are, and do they even go to the dentist. So yeah, that definitely sounds like an interesting bit of information. One thing that you mentioned was, of course, the difference of taking fluoride topically on our teeth, as in when we use a toothpaste or when we're at the dentist and we swish with fluoride and we have to spit it out, versus this is fluoride that we are taking systemically. And if you can just maybe describe, are there dangers of ingesting fluoride systemically that we should know about?
That's the $1 million question, and that's the crux of this argument against water fluoridation. Topical fluoride, which is what you mentioned, like in toothpaste, in small amounts. Now, if you read the back of a box of toothpaste, it'll say if you swallow more than a pea-size amount, you should contact a poison center. And that's scary, because if you break down the science on that, a pea-size amount of toothpaste is about 0.25 milligrams, 1/4 milligram of fluoride. Well, that's the exact same amount you get in 1 glass of water. So it's interesting that we're told to brush with such a small amount. But let's get back to the differences. Topical fluoride works in that it does affect the enamel in such a way to make it more resistant to cavities, for sure. But drinking it does not give you a topical effect. In fact, they've shown that to get any kind of a topical effect from drinking it, you'd have to hold it in your mouth for about 10 minutes and then swallow it. That's never going to happen. So we're ingesting this. So it's bypassing the whole topical effect. So your question about is there problems with it systemically, there's a lot of science showing that. In fact, there are certain subgroups that everybody actually recognizes, including our own government, that would be more susceptible. And it's more than you think. People with any kind of thyroid issues, because fluoride competes with iodine. So if you have any kind of iodine issues in your body, fluoride's going to win that fight and affect your thyroid gland. People with kidney functions, or dysfunction, I should say. If you can't clear the stuff out of your body, which is where fluoride's going to go, then you're going to keep it in your body. Children, elderly, pregnant women. There's a lot of subgroups that are very affected by this. People with diabetes, they're constantly having to drink and urinate. So it's just there's too many subgroups that are affected by this that should end the argument right there. Couple that with the fact that it doesn't do its intended function anyway, and I think it's a no-brainer.
Interesting. So you mentioned the EPA and Health and Human Services. Are those the primary government agencies, and are they overseeing water fluoridation? Have they really been able to determine what is a safe, optimal level of fluoride to be added to the water?
That's a great question. And actually, just last year, they lowered the safe level of fluoride from 1 part per million, which is the same thing as 1 milligram per liter, down to zero point 0.7. And the reason why they did it, they'll tell you that they're constantly looking at this to see what's an optimal level. But as I mentioned to you before, we've had that level for 50 years now, a little over 50 years. So now all of a sudden we're dropping it. And the reason why is we're seeing huge amounts of fluorosis. That's the modeling of the teeth on children. I'm seeing that probably once a week now. 10 years ago, I rarely saw it. So this cosmetic effect that we're seeing is actually more than just a cosmetic effect. It's just what we physically see. We don't know what's gone on systemically to get to that point. So 41% now of adolescents, 41% have some form of fluorosis on their teeth. And that was enough to even scare our agencies that, wow, they're getting too much. It's in our foods. It's in pesticides that are used in the crops. It's everywhere. So adding it to the water supply is one more huge insult. I would say that the CDC is also an agency. In fact, they have backed this since it was instituted. They constantly say it's one of the 10 greatest accomplishments of the 20th century and all this stuff. But, I can just tell you this, that the EPA, the Office of their Water Board, actually hired the National Research Council in 2002 to look at contaminants in water. And one of the main ones was fluoride. They wanted to know, is our MCLG, which is the maximum contaminant level goal, that's the level at which you can guarantee safety, meaning no harm to humans. Is our level at 4 parts per million still safe? So the National Research Council had 12 members, independent members, most toxicologists, scientists, a few other people, and they studied it for a long time, several years. 4 years later, they came out with a report in 2006, and they unanimously agreed that that level is not low enough. It's too high. So here we are now, 2012. We're now 6 years later, and nothing's been commented about it. Nothing's been done about it. So here was an independent council that was asked to do the studies. They went through the science. They showed that it's way too high. And by the way, fluoride is more toxic than lead, which has an MCLG of 0, and almost as toxic as arsenic, which has an MCLG of 0. So fluoride's is 4. I find it troubling.
That is definitely pretty troubling. Now, here in Austin, we've got Fluoride-Free Austin, which is a group dedicated to trying to get the fluoride out, and you had a big part in finding that group. Can you tell us a little bit about, are there other cities that are trying to get the water or trying to get the water defluoridated, and are there any cities that have succeeded in doing that?
Yeah, probably one of the bigger groups is the Keepers of the Well in San Diego. There's also the Safe Water Foundation, which is more of a national organization. San Diego was successful for many years in fighting it. They just recently became fluoridated, and I'm not sure that's going to hold, to be honest. But it's all done through grassroots level organizing. It's done through, getting a champion on the city council. It's done through trying to make, the onus is not on anti-fluoridationists. The onus is not on me to say that this stuff is bad, it should come out. It's on the proponents to prove that it's safe and effective, and they can't. And that's the issue. So if this actually went to court, and that's all we had to do was show just that there's maybe a hint of trouble, which we can easily do, and they had to prove that it was absolutely safe, it would never happen. But yet it never gets to that point, because most of the time when these things go to court or they go into litigation, it becomes an issue that the judge will usually rule that you and I as citizens don't have a constitutional right to fluoride-free water. And I find that odd. So, they're probably right. It's probably not in the Constitution, but I think it's sad that that's the way it's stated. Instead of saying, you have a constitutional right to choose what goes in your water or to just have clean water, safe water. That's not the case. So this becomes and this is why I got involved, because as a dentist now who was taught to think that it was the panacea, and in my first couple of years, I believe that as well. But when you actually start to take time and look at the science and realize that there's really nothing, there's no truly randomized clinical trial, a double-blind study that shows that it works, and there's never one to show that it's safe, and there's never been a follow-up one. So to me, I think that's already, but then when you start to go a little further and look into the science that's done by toxicologists worldwide, you're going to find nothing but negative on this stuff. I mean, it can cause a lot of systemic effects, as we mentioned earlier.
Interesting. And how much does the city of Austin spend to fluoridate our water? Is it something that's inexpensive or?
So, that's a great question. It's about $800,000 per year to buy the chemical from the company and then to actually maintain it. And there's been some exposés on our water treatment plants, and when you actually see the tank that holds the fluoride, it's pretty scary how it's so rusted around it because again, it's very, very corrosive. If these tankers that bring this stuff into our cities ever have a wreck, it's a huge biohazard accident. I mean, it's extremely toxic. And so that alone to me. Now people will tell you, yeah, everything's toxic in high amounts, but this is a very different bird because it's like we're drinking this. It's not just added to something that maybe makes it more pure, like the chlorine, which can be corrosive in and of itself, but when it's added to water, it helps. This is a medication that's added, and it's added without your consent. And again, it's a one size fits all. And so I I have a hard time wondering why we're still talking about this, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, with the amount of things that you know, I would imagine. So can you tell us where we could learn more about this and how we can maybe find you online?
Okay. Well, here in Austin, we've got the Fluoride Free Austin group, which I think is fluoridefreeaustin.com. If not, you can go to the email, which is info@fluoridefreeaustin. My website is just my name. It's just griffincole.com, griffincole.com. You'll find a little bit of information on fluoride there, but you'll find a lot more on the Fluoride Free Austin site. Keepersofthewell.org, I believe, is a really good one. Probably the best website out there on this whole topic, which has all the science, it has videos, it has everything, is Paul Connett's site, which is called the Fluoride Action Network, and the actual web address is fluoridealert.org, O-R-G, fluoridealert.org. Very important to make that distinction.
Very cool. Thank you so much for your time. And we'll talk in future videos more about the situation in Austin and a little more about fluoride. So be sure to subscribe to the channel for our future videos. Leave a comment if you have any questions, and we'll see you in the next video.